Good afternoon, grade 2s. So what we're going to be starting this week is our new science unit, and this is our last science unit of the year, and it's called Boats and Buoyancy. So I know the word buoyancy isn't something you probably hear very much of, but don't worry, you're going to learn lots about it in this unit. What buoyancy just means is how well something floats. So we're going to be learning a lot about floating and sinking, and what objects float and what ones sink, and how can we make objects float better. So this is just an introduction this week, and there's going to be an assignment at the end of this that will be posted on the web page, and you're going to be doing your own experimenting. So I'm going to read this book, and then you can follow the instructions on the website to complete your assignment for this week. So this is called Floating or Sinking. A natural force. A leaf floats on water. A pebble sinks in water. Why do some things float and why do some things sink? An object placed in water makes a place for itself by moving some of the water away from it. When the amount of water moved equals the upward force of the water, the object floats. An object's ability to float is called buoyancy. Things with good buoyancy float easily. So for example, right here on our page, we've got a jar filled with a sponge, a jar with a wooden block in it, and a jar with a metal cube in it. So you can see that the sponge is floating the best. It's nice and out of the water. There's not much underneath it. The buoyancy of the wooden block is not as good. About half of it's in the water. As you can tell, it's not floating as well as the sponge is. And the metal cube has no buoyancy at all because it's at the bottom of the jar. So if you've noticed over here, it says that there is an experiment, but actually you guys are going to be doing your own experiment this week, so we're just going to skip that part. But this kind of shows you buoyancy, how well something floats. The sponge floats the best, the wood block floats okay, and the metal cube floats not at all. It's right there at the bottom. Density and floating. Density describes how heavy or how light something is for its size. Objects that are light for their size float more easily. These things have low density. So if you take a rubber duck versus a real duck, objects that contain air are light for their size, like a rubber duck that has air inside. But a real duck has air inside too, in its lungs, its bones, and its feathers, so both ducks float. Objects that are heavy for their size sink. They have a higher density. The rocks in the fishbowl are small, but they're heavy for their size, which is why they don't have good buoyancy and they're at the bottom of the bowl. Things that are the same size can have different densities. Objects made of tightly packed materials are denser than objects made of loosely packed material. So these milk containers are the same size, but the empty milk container is lighter than the full one and has a lower density. So this empty milk jug has a lower density than the filled one. We're going to skip this page as well because we're doing our own experiment. Shape and floating. So do heavy things always sink? Do light things always float? A metal fork sinks, but many ships are made of metal, yet they float, which is amazing. Take a closer look at the fork and the ship. The fork has no way to trap air. The metal forming of the ship acts like a cup to hold air. The shape and size of a material can affect its ability to float. So you can see here that this metal spoon doesn't have anywhere to trap air to help it float, but this big boat has lots of air inside of it and it helps it float. So the rest of this book was just some experiments, but like I said, we're going to do our own experiments for today. So that's just a quick introduction to boats and buoyancy, mostly actually buoyancy, and just introduction on what makes things sink, what makes things float, and the buoyancy of an object can be different depending on the size and air, what it's filled with, and things that float have different buoyancies. So like we saw on our first page actually, even though the sponge and the wood block both float, the sponge has a better buoyancy than the wood block does. So I want you guys to go to our webpage to follow the instructions. You are going to have one assignment that has pictures of different items, and you need to choose whether they are going to float or if they are sinking. And then you are going to choose objects and items around your own household to write down and test in your own house, whether it's in the bathtub or in a sink or in a bowl of water. You're going to take those objects and put them in and see if they float or sink. But before you do that, you're going to make sure that you use your prediction. So remember, if you predict whether things float or sink, it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. When we're doing experimenting, predictions are just your best guess. And if you don't get it right, it's totally not a big deal. So follow the website for more instructions, and we'll see you guys soon.